Hello respected viewers, I'm George from Ireland. So here I am opposite 55 Lancaster Gate, London. And this is the birthplace of the late Honourable Alan Kenneth Mackenzie Clark, MP. So Alan Clark was born here on the 13th day of April, 1928. So we're coming up to the centenary of his birth. And a blue plaque is affixed on the address of a distinguished person, either 100 years after he or she was born, or indeed at least 20 years after the person's death. And the quarter century since his death is coming up on the 7th of September this year. So the Honourable Alan Clark was known as the most incautious, outspoken, outrageous Conservative MP of his generation. But he could afford to be that because in 1983 he inherited £33 million. Now what's £33 million 40 years later? You could probably at least quadruple that to get modern values, and obviously had plenty of money growing up. So he's born here, and his father was Kenneth Clark, later Lord Clark, commonly called Lord Clark of Civilization. So the Clark family had come from Paisley in North Britain, where they made a fortune in the mid-19th century. I think they had some factory making thread or something like that. And after that, they were gentlemen of leisure. So Kenneth Clark, he'd gone to Winchester College, New College, Oxford. New was the Oxford College associated with his school. His New's proper name is something like the Winchester College of St. Mary the Virgin in Oxford. Anyway, and then he was director of the National Gallery. He was friends with all the great and the good in the 1920s, 1930s. He moved in high society. He was a friend of King George V, and he ran the gallery through the Second World War. Most of its objets d'art were put in a coal mine in Wales to save them in case a bomb hit the National Gallery, but just one a week was brought out and displayed to buoy up national morale, and then people would queue in the rain to go in and actually see that, the only art treasure on display. So he was a left-winger in his political sympathies, voted Labour most of the time, so friends with Labour MPs and indeed Liberal MPs, notwithstanding his very upper-class background. That was Kenneth Clark. Now, Alan Clark's mother, she was half Irish. Alan Clark's grandmother, or maternal grandmother, she was from Dublin, and she was one of the first women in Ireland to qualify as a doctor. But Alan Clark was not particularly feminist despite that. We're coming back to Alan Clark. So he was the eldest child. In 1932, he was joined by the twins Colette and Colin. So he went to, I think it was St Cyprian's Prep School in Eastbourne, the same one that George Orwell lacerated in Such Were the Joys, his memoir of his time there with Cyril Connolly. From there, Alan Clark went to Eton, where he was not into sports at all. He became good friends with Ewan, what's the surname? Is a distinctly Ewan Graham, who was the grandson of the Duke of Montrose, as in the Duke of Montrose's daughter was his mother, if I got that right. Anyway, and Anthony Blonde. Now, Alan Clark later professed anti-Semitic opinions. Methinks he was just playing it for laughs, because Anthony Blonde was his best friend at Eton and Oxford, places where, you know, the Jewish community was under sort of 3% of the school. So I think it's highly unlikely he would have sought out this person as his best friend out of all the others if he really was an anti-Semite. But it was certainly distasteful, this seam of humour that he sought to pursue. So he had a blameless Eton, not particularly distinguished indeed academically, went up to Christ Church, Oxford, the grandest college in Oxford. In those days it wasn't difficult. There were about as many applicants as places. He had to sit responsions, which is the entrance exam in Latin, Ancient Greek and mathematics. No exam in English, of course. And so people at public school, they had to do Latin and Greek. At state school, some that did Latin, virtually nobody did Greek. So that was it, and just breezed through. When he was at school, there was the OTC, Officer Training Corps, it was then called, which was compulsory. The Second World War was on. And he managed to join the Household Cavalry Training Regiment in February 1945. So the Second World War was still on for another 6 months, even though he was 16 at the time, and he never left the United Kingdom. He was nowhere near danger, but he was delighted that, strictly speaking, he was a serving member of the armed forces during the Second World War. I don't think he got a campaign medal for it. But as I understand, he was able to leave it. I don't think he actually did national service, but he was fixated by militaria for the rest of his life. So at Christ Church he read history, which he pursued desultorily, and he was awarded with a third. Hugh Trevor Roper, that celebrated historian was the Don who was his tutor. People say he was a star pupil, but he didn't shine academically, even if he had élan vital. But his real passion was motorsport back then. He bought a lot of cars. Remember, just after the Second World War, these things were very expensive. They were beyond the reach of all except the upper class and the upper middle class. It's not to the 60s that only a car became an ordinary thing. That's when car ownership quadrupled in a decade, and we're talking about the late 1940s. So he used to buy classic cars. Then he read for the bar in the old gentlemanly fashion of being called to the bar without the least intention of ever practicing, being called to the bar simply as part of his education. And then he was just a man about town, and he wrote for the motoring press and collected cars and so on. He was a playboy, so he then began to research military history. He eventually published The Donkeys, which did not endear him to the top brass. And it was a study of British generalship in the Second World War, and it really savaged the reputation of the British officer corps. And it was the inspiration for Oh, What a Lovely War, an early 1960s musical which satirised the Second World War, its supposed futility, the mutton-minded generals and so on. And it was then turned into a well-received film. It mortally offended some people. Remember, it's only 50 years after the First World War, and a lot of the veterans were still alive, and some of them felt that they were being mocked, the ordinary soldiers, not just the officers, and to suggest that their comrades had died for nothing was false and grossly offensive, and so on. Anyway, it's only later he got into politics. But when he was 28, he was walking his dog along the beach near the English Channel, and he bumped into a 14-year-old girl who was walking her dog, and he began a romance with her. Now, such a liaison would be regarded with less indulgence these days. A rather opprobrious term would be used for him. But 4 years later, he married that Caroline Beutler, whose father was an officer in the Duke of Wellington's regiment. He insisted Caroline go by the name Jane, because Alan's mother was Jane, and she was anything but maternal. So people said, bizarrely, although this girl was half his age when he met her, he insisted that she be motherly to him. But his adultery began almost straight away. But she was astonishingly tolerant of his shenanigans. So he never once committed fidelity. So they were blessed with 2 sons in short order. But he was not particularly happy at Eton Clark, I think, because that's why his sons both went to Eastbourne College. There was no thought that they should go there. But he said it was a very sound education and a good introduction to adult life and politics, where there's a lot of backstabbing and schadenfreude. So he also wrote Barbarossa, about a study of the Russo-Soviet, sort of the Germano-Soviet conflict, and his professed sympathies for National Socialism in Germany was really nauseating, which I like to think was just an ill-judged drollery. So finally he decided to go into politics. He was a member of the British Conservative Monday Club, which is very much on the right of the Conservative and Unionist Party, said that the white minority government in Rhodesia ought to be supported and so forth. There should be no sanctions on apartheid South Africa. Well, they got their way on that one. Anyway, that Commonwealth immigration should be severely restricted and so forth. So he was elected in 1974 for the Plymouth division Sutton division of Plymouth. David Owen, a Labour MP, had previously held the seat, who later went on to be the youngest Foreign Secretary this century, founder of the Social Democratic Party, and so on, Prime Ministerial hopeful. David Owen, that psychiatrist who's still alive. I've corresponded with him. I've been to a speech by him once. I do wish I could meet him again. But come back to Alan Clark. So he represented that seat, and he was a Thatcherite before Thatcher. He also confessed to fancying her and saying she had pretty ankles, all the rest of it. So Thatcher came into government in 1979. He was hoping to be promoted to a cabinet. He never managed it. He had to work in he was a junior minister in the Department for Employment, which really was, for him, was purgatorial tedium. So he really only cared about the armed forces and foreign affairs and so forth. He actually didn't care about the condition of England, as Australia would have called it, or the betterment of the majority of people, public services, anything like that. He pursued his career with an insouciance you can only do when you've got tens of millions of pounds behind you, able to live on the interest. His father bought Saltwood Castle in Kent from the Deeds family. Lord Bill Deeds was later editor of the Daily Telegraph, Tory MP. He'd lived there. But Saltwood Castle famously was where the murder of Thomas Becket was where the murderers hid after they'd killed him in the cathedral, in Canterbury Cathedral. And Alan Clark, he also had a chalet at Zermatt, Switzerland, and then he used to stay in the Albany. That was his bachelor pad. There wasn't actually a bachelor in central London, and that's where he'd bring his mistresses and so on. So then through the 80s, he pursued an affair with this South African lady, Valerie Harkis, who's married to a well-known judge, supposed with her 2 daughters. But then there was an allegation that he exposed himself to one of them when she was 13. I've no idea if that's true. But again, these days, that might be curtains for his political career. So he managed to be a junior minister in the armed forces in the late 1980s, and Tom King was a defense secretary with whom he had a somewhat fractious relationship, but Tom King was very forgiving towards him. He got away with astonishing things, Alan Clark, openly denouncing governmental policy on question time. It would be enough to have anybody else sacked, but I don't know why he was forgiven so much. Then he left politics in 1992, then said it was a colossal mistake, managed to get back in 1997, was selected for Kensington and Chelsea. I remember meeting someone from the Kensington-Chelsea Conservative Association just after Clark died, and said that he went for this sort of adoption meeting, and if somebody had asked him a question about what should have been done in 1941, he would have told people, because he was searingly, self-defeatingly honest, and said the United Kingdom ought to have made peace in 1941. He said it's not about trusting Hitler, that there's obsolescence of the very concept of trust when you come to someone like Hitler, but it's a community of interests, that the United Kingdom ought to have pulled out of the war at that stage. And a lot of people in the Kensington and Chelsea Conservative Association had been in the war, and they would regard that as heretical. He would have been selected, but nobody asked him. He was selected, and indeed it was the second safest Conservative constituency in the United Kingdom, and he was duly returned with 55% of the vote. But he was dying of a brain tumour, diagnosed about that time. He possibly had it for rather longer than people realised, which might have explained his extraordinarily erratic behaviour. So he died on the 7th of September 1999. Some of his last forays in politics were to attack Tony Blair for only addressing Parliament once a week, Prime Minister's Question Time. He'd amalgamated the sessions, the 2 15-minute sessions, into one of half an hour to allow him to travel around the country more. Or the other one is, he said the United Kingdom should not be bombing Serbia to help the Kosovo Liberation Army, because he said there were Islamist terrorists, drug traffickers, people traffickers, and so on. So that is him. He's buried in the grounds of Saltwood Castle, which is not open to the public. I'd really like to go. And he's known for being the soul of indiscretion and his hilarious diaries. He also attracted controversy for the Matrix Churchill affair, the arms to Iraq affair. There was this machine tool company called Matrix Churchill, based in the English Midlands, and there was an embargo on weapon sales to Iraq, or anything that could be used to make weapons. But some executives of the company came to speak to him, and he told them that he knew what was going on, and they were to just go ahead and do it anyway and earn some money for the UK. But he only said it impliedly. Anyway, so the idea was these machine tools were then going to be used to make weapons, but they were dual use. It's possible they could be used for a civilian application. And anyway, some executives in the company were charged with breaching the embargo. They could have gone to jail for several years. But in the Old Bailey, Alan Clark testified that he was economical with the actualité. On this basis, the prosecution was withdrawn. But the way he walked around with his swaying swagger and swank to address the camera, it was almost effeminate. That was him. But in his own mind, he was a ladies' man, a complete philanderer. But some women found him tiresome, said that he regarded the word no as playing hard to get. Well, they don't make him like that anymore. I don't think he'd get very far in the Conservative Party these days. That is the late Alan Clark. Okay, so you really should see his diaries. I've got to read that biography by Jon Truin, and recommend to you some of his books. His History of the Tory Party and the Nation State from 1922 to 1997, and there was a television series in the autumn of 1997, just after that catastrophic Conservative defeat. He was able to present that. So I've watched that a few times. There was a series Love Tory about him as well. And then the Alan Clark Diaries was serialised about 2004 with John Hurt, a leftist, playing Alan Clark. Thank you so much for watching my channel. So make sure you subscribe on Patreon and donate on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Right, cheerio.